Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. My name is Brianna and this is For Pause in a Book. I make book and lifestyle related content, so if that's something that you're interested in, make sure to hit that subscribe button down below. Today I'm going to be talking to you all about the books that I read in the month of March. So March started off really rough, but we came back with a vengeance. I didn't finish my first book until like the 5th or 6th, but I ended up reading 24 books. So we still ended up with like almost a book a day after that little like week-long slump there. It also ended up being one of the best months in terms of quality. I've had the most 5-star reads that I've had all year in a single month. So that was fantastic. If you are new to my wrap-ups or my channel, and if I do a mid-month wrap-up, I talk about those in chronological order, and then when I get to my end-of-month wrap-up, that's when I get to talk about all the cool nerdy stats. I'll leave a timestamp down below if you're not into like the nerdy statistics like I am, but for those of you that love it as much as I do, here you go. I read, like I said, 24 books, 7,341 pages. Fantastic reading month. Not quite as good as February with its like 8,000 pages, but like that I was doing a challenge, so it's fine. I had one reread, I had one DNF, and I started 9 series this month, so love that for me. Like I said, my average was a 3.61. I had 4 5-star reads. 4 of them! I haven't done that in a long time, okay? Listen. 5 stars have been few and far between. I had 2 4.5 stars, 4 4 stars, 3 3.5 stars, 6 3 stars, 3 2.5 stars, and 1 2-star, and then I didn't have any 1 or 1.5 star reads, which was good. I've had a couple of those in the past few months as well, so I'm glad to be out of that routine. I read 18 novels and 5 novellas, 0 graphic novels. There were a lot of novellas just because it was Tor.com-a-thon, and a lot of Tor.com titles are novellas, so I read a lot of those. I read 2 contemporaries, 9 fantasies, 1 historical, 3 horror, 3 romance, 4 sci-fi, and 1 thriller. So fantasy is definitely like creeping up and being the biggest genre that I'm reading this year, and I think it'll probably definitely overtake it after Realmathon. We'll see. I read 17 books targeted at an adult audience, 1 targeted at a new adult audience, and 5 books targeted at a YA audience. This is probably the biggest month for YA reads that I've had in a while. As far as how I read these books, I read 10 via audiobook, 3 via ebook, 3 physically, and 7 as a mixture. So I listened to the audiobook while reading it physically, or I listened to part of it and read part of it physically. That's just what mixture means. With that being said, let's talk about the books. So we're going to start with my DNF, and that was Who Fears Death by Nnedi Okorafor. This is definitely not the right book for me at the right time. I only made it about 100 pages in, and I've heard really good things about this book, but it starts out with an assault, and it was constantly talking about the terrible way in which women were being treated. They were being kidnapped, they were being used, they were like everything. Trying to stay monetized here, but like it, not a good time, right? And I just wasn't in the headspace for that, so I went ahead and put it down and DNF'd it. I was trying to read it for a Our Fantasy bingo board spot, and I was able to find a substitution, so I was still able to finish Our Fantasy, which is great. There will be an Our Fantasy for 2023. I will be doing a TBR video for that coming soon, so stay tuned for that. But all in all, this was just this book isn't for me kind of book. Next up, we have our 2-star reads, and I did already talk about this one in my mid-month wrap-up, so if you want to check that out, I will link it up above, but that was Into the Mist by PC Cast. I had 3 2.5-star reads. The first one I did talk about in my mid-month wrap-up, and that was The Boy in the Black Suit by Jason Reynolds. I also read The Echo Wife by Sarah Gailey and gave this one 2.5 stars. This one actually has a lot of praise, and a lot of people that I have very similar ratings to, and like likes and dislikes in books, gave this one a really high rating, and I just was so bored. This is a very detached writing style. It is about a woman whose husband created a clone of his wife and like fixed all of the things that he didn't like in his wife, and then something happens, and essentially the two, like the wife and the clone, have to work together. And I think that that's a really interesting concept for some sort of like sci-fi thriller, but unfortunately, because the writing style was so detached and like lacking any emotion. She was very much a like scientist, and so that's just how she came across in her writing, and she like didn't have any emotion, and because of that I just couldn't get behind any of the characters. I didn't care about what was going on, and I was bored. That is not a long book. It's under 300 pages. It's closer to like 250, I think. And this book took me like 4 days to finish because I just didn't want to finish it. I also finished Miss Percy's Pocket Guide to the Care and Feeding of British Dragons by Quinby Olson. This book will be in one of my SPFBO vlogs, which will be coming out later on this month. So I'm not going to go into a ton of detail about this, but this is very much a cozy fantasy. It's a Regency style story with a little dragon. Essentially, this woman inherits her great uncle, I think, has all of these like treasures from all of his, you know, world travels. And one of them is this little rock. Except it's not actually a rock, it's a dragon egg, and the dragon egg hatched. This, I think, suffers from mismarketing or something. Because when I read Miss Percy's Pocket Guide to the Care and Feeding of British Dragons, I'm expecting like a guidebook on how to care for dragons, but the character's actually like trying to figure it out as we go. And so like she doesn't really understand what's going on. And the world building was really confusing because it was like all of a sudden there is a dragon in Regency London, but no one can explain why. No one can explain, like, it's essentially lore at this point, or a myth. But then at the same time, no one was like really freaked out by the fact that they have a winged lizard sitting in their living room. I think that if you liked Scales and Sensibility, you will probably like this one. I do think that Scales was better than this one, just in terms of writing style and world building, and this one has more of a romance plot. This one is more of a like adventure story. And like just trying to figure out how things are happening. But I do think that they're pretty comparable titles. Next up are my 3-star reads. I did have 6 of them, so it was still a pretty mid-month. 4 of them I talked about in my mid-month wrap-up. So at least the second half of the month was better than the first half of the month, right? So the books that I talked about in my mid-month wrap-up were Goliath by Tochi Buchi, Mysterious Ways by Abby Evans, Burning Roses by S.L. Huang, and Ophelia After All by Raquel Marie. I also gave 3 stars to Love After the End, an anthology of two-spirit and indigiqueer speculative fiction, edited by Joshua Whitehead. And here's the thing, I need to like preface this. I am not saying that this is a bad book at all. A lot of times people think of 3-star reads and they automatically like think that I hated a book. I did not hate this book. I am a very character-driven reader. And so short stories are a struggle for me because some of these stories were only 5-6 pages. And so if you like short stories, I think that this was a fantastic collection. There's a lot of creativity and imagination because a lot of these things take place in near or far future dystopians, or like, you know, there's like colony on the moon. This is like very much sci-fi, and you can really take a lot of creative liberty when you are creating a short story in the future, because there's not as much world building. But when my 2 favorite things in a story are character development and world building, short stories are a struggle, especially when they are speculative. So if you like short stories, this is fantastic. I think that the writing was really, really good. I really liked the Darcy Little Badger one. That was probably my favorite. But for me, personally, it was a 3-star read. And this happens a lot with short stories in general because there are some that you really, really love and some that you didn't like. And so it just kind of like averages out. I read this super fast. It's very short. I read this specifically for the Trans Rights Readathon, but it was also in our fantasy bingo board space where you had to read an anthology. And so that's why I picked this up in the first place. You're thinking, why, if you know you don't like short stories, why did you pick it up? This is why I had to. I also gave 3 stars to The Adventures of Amina Alsarafi by Shannon Chakraborty, or S.A. Chakraborty. This is the same author that did the David Bad trilogy, and I love that trilogy. I love that series. This one was fine. It was nothing special, and I didn't necessarily like the direction that she went with this book. This book is about an older woman who is retired from being a pirate, but she is given this last chance to do this big job, and so then she goes out onto the sea again. She's trying to, like, collect her old gang, you know, kind of, like, get the gang back together. And so, like, that part was kind of fun, but there's very little fantasy in this until the end. This is the book that we read on sprints for the Late Night Crew, and everyone in the chat was like, where is the killer octopus? in the water. We haven't seen a killer octopus. This cover is fantastic, and I will still keep this book and probably continue on with the series. But personally, it was not a favorite of mine. We are told again and again and again that this is a badass pirate and she was the top of her game, and, you know, everyone was afraid of her. But we kept being told that. We never saw why. We were never shown how she was a badass. We were never shown why people are scared of her. I think this would have been so fun if we would have had some flashback scenes, or like times when like she was being a badass before and like it paralleling her current adventure or something like that. But instead we were just kind of like told these war stories. And so for me it was just disappointing. Like, it's not a bad book, but I had such high expectations for it because I really love pirate books, right? Like, they are fun. And it being S.I. Chakraborty and how much I loved City of Brass, I had 5-star expectations for this book. And I have said this so many times before. A 3-star read has so much variety to it. A lot of times this is a book that exists and I read it type of vibe. And then other times it's a, I had such high expectations for you and you let me down. So for that reason, it's a 3-star read. I had 3.5-star reads, and 2 of them I talked about in my mid-month wrap-up. The first one is Finlay Donovan Jumps the Gun by El Casamano. This is the 3rd book in the Finlay Donovan series. And also The Pledge by Cale Dietrich. This is a book that we read on sprints. Cal and I read this, like, the entire thing on sprints together, and we will be talking about this next week. I have the live show. I will link it up above. It's already scheduled and ready to go, but we will be discussing this in depth later on this week. I also read Silver in the Wood by Emily Tesh, and this is a like whimsical fantasy novella that I read super quickly. It was also in our fantasy bingo board slot that I needed to fill, and I had a really big book slotted for it, and we knew that wasn't going to happen by the end of March, so we went with a novella. This book gives me House on the Cerulean Sea vibes. It gives me, weirdly enough, the child's book Frog and Toad Go on Adventures, or whatever that book is called. It gives me those vibes. This book is a super whimsical story. It is about this old grumpy man who lives in the woods, and there is definitely some magic to these woods, and somehow this property gets claimed or owned by this other man who comes in, and they start a cute little romance. It's definitely a self-discovery book. It's definitely like a book where he has to come to grips with some things that are in his past that he doesn't necessarily want to deal with. But overall, this was such a good palate cleanser. It was a very quick read, and it was one of the ones that I read for Tor.com. Next up, I had 4 4-star reads, and 2 of them I talked about in my mid-month wrap-up, and that was Skyward by Brandon Sanderson and Ship of Smoke and Steel by Django Wexler. This is the first book in his YA series. I also gave 4 stars to Submit to Him by Tegan Wells. This is a little KU novella that I read on my lunch break one day. This is from an author that I kind of sort of know personally, like I'm online acquaintances with, so like my review might be a little bit biased, but this was pretty good. This was very short. I think it was like 65 pages or something like that. I wanted to read the first book in this series because there might be something that's happening in May that I wanted to read the rest of the series and possibly recommend the series, so I wanted to make sure that the first one was good. And it was. I mean, like, again, a little bit biased, but it was fantastic. This is about a woman who is very type A, very structured. She is a paralegal or a law student, something, and she has done all of this research on BDSM clubs and specific doms because she wants to, like, have a dom so that she can release control. Which, like, a mood, right? And it ends up that she matches with the owner of this club, and I mean, it's a like very sexy, smutty novella. There's not a lot of plot to it. It's kind of a standalone. There are other novellas in this series, but they're all different people. But I had a good time. Was there a lot to this book? No. But, like, it was fun. I also gave 4 stars to Even Though I Knew the End by C.L. Polk. This is actually the group book for Tor.comathon, so we'll actually be discussing it on Bethany's channel. We're going to be talking about all things Tor.comathon, but we will specifically be discussing this book as well. And I really enjoyed this. This gives me Diviners / Infernal Devices vibes, but make it really gay. This is a sapphic mystery where she is a detective and she is like trying to find what ends up being a demon. There's a lot that goes on in this tiny, tiny little novella. I would have loved to see a full-length novella, and I believe, correct me in the comments if I'm wrong, but I believe someone told me that The Midnight Bargain by this same author is kind of a continuation of this or an extension of that story, so I definitely will have to pick that book up if that is the case. Overall, I really enjoyed this, and I'm really excited to talk about this with the other Tour.comathon host. I had 2 4.5-star reads, and the first one I did talk about in my mid-month wrap-up, and that was If the Shoe Fits by Julie Murphy. The second one was my reread, and that was Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I've had this audiobook on hold for like 3 months at my library because everyone wanted to read it with the show coming out. And now that I've watched the show, I was like, well, I now need to read the book. Because I wanted to see, it's been a long time since I've read this book. I read this as an arc originally. And so I wanted to see how the show held up to the book and like, you know, what changes were made. I think I actually like the show better than the book. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love this book. But I think that the show did such a phenomenal job capturing some of the smaller moments in this book that didn't necessarily get as much time and attention as it could have. And just in a visual media, you're able to do that so much better. I do think that the casting for the show was fantastic, especially now going back and reading this, because it does talk about some character descriptions. And I was like, that's perfect, right? If you don't know what this book or the show is about, it is kind of a memoir style story. It's kind of written as a documentary, and it's recounting the band The Six and its headliner Daisy Jones, and like how they rose to stardom from being absolute nobodies. This book takes place primarily in the 70s, and so like obviously there is a lot of like sex, drugs, and rock and roll. There are a lot of trigger warnings for alcohol abuse, drug abuse, cheating, death of a loved one, as well as a host of other things. So definitely check trigger warnings. This is a much darker book than you might expect for it just being like a book about a band, but I absolutely love this book. The audiobook is a full cast narration, so I highly recommend you go that route if you can listen to audiobooks. It's fantastic. Now, moving on to my 5 stars. I had 4 of them, and I only talked about one of them in my mid-month wrap-up, and that was Secrets in the Dark by Darcy Coates. I did, in fact, not finish any more in this series. However, Whispers in the Mist is on my April TBR, so I will continue the series then. I also read The Fastest Way to Fall by Denise Williams. This was my water bowl pick for my top tier patrons, and I gave it 5 stars, so like maybe I should let them pick my books more often. This is a contemporary romance, and I think the body positivity conversations and the like fitness conversations, especially when you are plus size, like all of that was so beautifully done that I just fell in love with this book. The romance is very standard, right? It's about a woman who is testing out an app as like a fitness influencer, as a plus size fitness influencer, and she ends up like becoming friends with her coach, who is also like the creator of the app, and then they start this like little secret identity friends to lovers romance. So like very standard, right? But there was just so much nuance in this book. The third act breakup, I think, was done phenomenally well because it wasn't just these 2 characters being stupid. Very rarely do I like a third act breakup, but this one I felt was realistic. Anyway, thank you so much to Crystal for recommending this book. It's been sitting on my shelf for far too long, and I'm really glad I read it. All right, and then I also read Fireborn by Rosaria Munda. This is the first book in a political YA fantasy series, and I'm already reading the second book, so you can tell how much I love this. This book has a lot of things that I necessarily wouldn't like in a book, mostly being a YA romance, but it's very much overshadowed by the political intrigue and the revolution and the conversations about classism and this just like government propaganda, and then there's like a little romance. And honestly, even that is done really, really well. So even if you're like opposed to that, still really love this book. I would say that 75% of the time, I didn't even think that this was a YA book, and then like they would do silly teenager things, and I'd be like, oh yeah, you are. This first book has a competition in it. The 2 main characters that you are following are trying to compete to become a dragon rider, and they come from very different stations in life, and so it's really interesting to see like the things that the government is trying to put in place and this like propaganda that they are trying to spit out, and and all of these different like rules and regulations, you're seeing the effects of them from two different people with two very different life situations. And I just think that was so well done. The parallels in this were fantastic. I am already reading Flamefall, which is the second book. This is my first book of April, and I'm already loving it even more than Fireborn, if that's possible. And then my favorite book of the month, which surprises me, honestly. Because so many people told me, oh, you might not like this, and I absolutely loved it. It was my perfect brand of fantasy, and that is A Touch of Light by Tiago Abdallah. This is another like political fantasy. We are definitely seeing a theme here, a trend. This is about two warring nations, one that worships light and life, and one that respects the dead, and death is a part of how their kingdom can thrive. And obviously those two kingdoms are going to clash a little bit because, you know, they are the opposite. This really dives into like the religion of the kingdoms, which is another thing that I really, really love in books, when religion is used, but it's not like a Christian-based religion. Tiago was so creative with this, and that's one of the things that I really loved. This book throws you in the deep end. Like, this is not a hold your hand type of fantasy book. And in my review on Goodreads, I'm like, I loved this book. Did I know what was going on most of the time? Absolutely not. But I was just here for the ride. This book I would very much say is like surfing. Because you have no idea where you are going in that. But you're just riding the waves. And that's what I was doing with this book, and I was here for it. I'm really excited to pick up A Shade of Madness. I'm hoping to do that in April. It didn't officially make my April TBR, but it is a book that I'm highly anticipating. So while Spiffbo has definitely given me some duds, I've gotten a few wins from it as well. So that's great. All right, those are the books that I read in the month of March. Let me know down below what your favorite book of the month was, or if you're not feeling chatty, you can do a sword emoji. That is all I have for you today. If you are new here and you have not yet subscribed, there's a little red button that you can do so down below the video. If you'd like to hang out with me more, the links to my Instagram, Goodreads, Twitter, and my Patreon are linked in the description below. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye.